Welcome back, horror fans, cinephiles, and Giallo enthusiasts. It's Tanner Leeser, your host for The King in Giallo. This is episode 17 of the Forgotten Giallo film series, 1971, Part 1, and I've got 3 gialli here I'd like to highlight. As always, thanks in no small part to Troy Howarth's book on Giallo cinema, So Deadly, So Perverse, 50 Years of Italian Giallo Films, Volume 1, 1963 to 1973. Like this video and subscribe to The King in Giallo. Click the notification bell icon so YouTube doesn't hide my new content from you. If you enjoy what I do here, please consider subscribing to my Patreon. On to the video. The third Giallo of 1971 and first film for our video is Devil's Ransom, sometimes called No Way Out. The film is an Italian, Spanish, and French co-production. The film is directed by Piero Schumet, who also co-wrote the film along with Tiziano Cortini and Julio Salvador. Music is by Piero Piccioni. The cast consists of Marissa Mell as Michelle, Philippe Leroy as Gilbert, Leah Massari as Britt, Roger Hannon as Kurt, and Jorge Rigaud as Bergman. The plot follows Gilbert, who despite having a good job at a Swedish bank working as a courier, has a nightmare of a home life due chiefly to the fact that he is carrying on an affair against his wife Michelle with his mistress Britt. Things become worse for Gilbert after an unknown man kidnaps their child and Michelle is in shambles. Gilbert is unable by the kidnapper to reveal anything to anybody, including police, forcing him to come up with a plan to amass $200,000 to pay the ransom. This hard-to-find movie transitions from a melodrama into a kidnap flick, and by the end has become a giallo. It is able to resist the usual giallo genre trappings which plague countless films in the genre, but ultimately bends to the norms once it unveils its plot, involving blackmail of the sexual variety, and introduces a good double-cross or two. The film has a lot working for it. The Swedish setting is new and adds a lot of style to the backdrop of the plot's action. The characters are thoughtfully conceived and acted. Gilbert is familiar in the character's broad strokes, but is played with an air of sympathy despite not being wholly innocent or exempt from his faults. Michelle is sexy, yet manages to avoid the usual depiction of women in the genre, and breathes new life and sincerity into her character with her performance and heartbreak over her missing child. Piero Schumet's style of filmmaking in this project is to play it straight and less flashy and stylish. He treats the subject matter with respect and dedicates plenty of focus to the characters. This isn't to say that the film is pretentious or devoid of any sleaze. As the plot thickens, the kidnapper uses manipulation to capitalize on Michelle's state of mind, and violence does erupt along the way. Giallo veterans populate the cast and turn in some of their best performances, which they oftentimes were not able to do working in past thrillers. It is wonderful to see so many gifted actors able to sink their teeth into truly great roles and work at a capacity that allows them to showcase their talent. Roger Hannon from Rocco and His Brothers, 1960, makes his one Giallo appearance and nails it as the abhorrent kidnapper. This was the only film by Piero Schumet, which is truly unfortunate because based off of this film alone, it could be conceived that he would have had a great run as a director. The next Giallo is The Man with Icy Eyes, an Italian production. The film is directed by Alberto De Martino, written by Adriano Balzoni, Massimo De Rita, Arduino Meori, and Vincenzo Manino. Music is by Peppino De Luca. The cast is comprised of Antonio Sabato as Eddie Mills, Barbara Boucher as Anne Sachs, Victor Buono as John Hammond, Faith Domergue as Mrs. Valdez, Keenan Wynn as Harry Davis, and Corrado Gaipa as Isaac Thetman. The plot follows reporter Eddie Mills, who becomes involved in a case where a state senator was murdered by a Mexican man described as having icy eyes, who is arrested as the killer. Using a stripper's eyewitness testimony, Eddie helps get the man put behind bars, but he begins to realize that her story has some holes in it, and fears that he may have put an innocent man in jail. Eddie teams with his editor, John Hammond, to uncover the truth and to help exonerate the man with icy eyes before he is executed. Things get more interesting after a psychic tells Eddie to beware, because he will soon be dead. The director, Alberto De Martino, is an Italian director known for making films in such a way that they come off more like American films. This could be said to be a tactful approach, but many of his films end up lacking personality, and despite being professionally made, they don't quite reach that tipping point of sparking much interest. A satisfactory hour and a half past could be said of many of his films. The movie does contain decent plot twists, one of which is related to daylight savings, and there are some areas of the plot which are creative and inspired. The added angle of the bigotry aimed at the Mexican populace from the panel of white characters seems rather tacked on, as this was the thing to do at the time, and it lacks any depth to create true meaning within the story. The suspense is not well handled, the kills are bloodless, and things hardly get any sleazier than a quick nude scene in the beginning. The dialogue drags, but to the director's credit, there are a handful of solid sequences near the climax. Antonio Cebedo is fine as the lead. The character is interesting as he is an Italian in America who has struggled to make a name for himself and finally has with his recent report, but now he must work harder to redeem himself and right the wrong he has started. In the hands of a more charismatic actor, the character could have leapt off the screen. Cebedo would go on to appear in Umberto Lenzi's Seven Blood-Stained Orchids, 1972. Barbara Boucher provides eye candy for the film, and her character is moderately engaging as the stripper who may or may not be working with the killer. Some of the other roles, however, come off as if they were filmed in a few days, tops. Victor Buono is working the hardest of all the cast. The actor began in television and made a name for himself in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, 1962, where he received an Oscar nomination. Buono would always bring a lot of energy to his parts and never crossed over into overdoing it. His presence adds compassion and humor to the film. The third and final film for this video is The Designated Victim, also called Slam Out. It is an Italian production. The film is directed by Maurizio Lucidi, written by Fulvio Gica Palli. Music is by Luis Enriquez Bacalov. The cast is made up of Tomas Milian as Stefano Argenti, Pierre Clementi as Count Matteo Tiepolo, Katia Christine as Fabian Beranger, Luigi Casellato as Commissioner Finzi, and Marisa Bartoli as Luisa Argenti. The plot follows Stefano, who is an unhappily married head of an ad agency. He wants to sell his shares in the company, which are in his wife's name, and run off with his mistress. His wife, Luisa, stops his attempt, but this leads to him meeting Count Matteo, who gets Stefano to agree to a deal whereby they each will kill off someone for the other. The Designated Victim is an uncredited, unofficial remake of the same story of Strangers on a Train, 1950 by Patricia Highsmith, which would be adapted the next year by Alfred Hitchcock. Highsmith's writing is perfect for giallo films, and it is a wonder that her stories were never used for such films. She would also write a book series about Tom Ripley, a fictional character who is a career criminal, a con artist, and a serial killer. Such film adaptations include Purple Noon, 1960 by René Clément, The American Friend, 1977 by Wim Wenders, The Talented Mr. Ripley, 1999 by Anthony Minghella, and Ripley's Game, 2002 by Liliana Cavani. The new adaptation here retains a bit of the original themes and plot threads, but strips away the smarter wit of the source material. Stefano comes off as our typical giallo cad, who is adulterous, unhappy, and unfulfilled despite his successes. The relationship struck up by Stefano and the Count is reminiscent of the original dynamic, with one being more unhinged and dangerous, and the relationship leaning towards being more one-sided than truly equal. The two men contrast each other, and each somewhat finds their antithesis within the other. As is pretty typical with Highsmith's world, there is an underlying subtext of homosexuality, and the movie retains this and toys with it without ever stating anything out loud, and purely plays visual hints. the story does end up taking a completely new deviation from the source material. The direction of the film is well handled, doesn't indulge itself with glamorous stylistic choices, and is not afraid to take its time and slowly ramp up its action. The soundtrack adds to the contemplative and atmospheric aura the film is building towards, and contributions from progressive rock group New Trolls are utilized, as well as vocals from Tomas Milian. Speaking of Milian, he is amazing in his role. The Cuban actor was born in 1932, emigrated to the US in the 1950s, and then joined the Actors Studio after becoming inspired by James Dean. He began his craft on the stage, but would segue into pictures such as The Big Night, 1959 by Mauro Bolognini, the anthology Boccaccio 70, 1962, in the segment directed by Luchino Visconti, and Time of Indifference, 1964 by Francesco Maselli. Milian would take on spaghetti western roles and would become a star, beginning with The Big Gundown, 1966 by Sergio Sollima, Face to Face, 1967, also Sollima, Django Kill, 1967 by Giulio Chesti, Four of the Apocalypse, 1975 by Lucio Fulci, and becoming a huge star in Italian genre flicks, he would spread into polizieschi films such as Bandits in Milan, 1968, Almost Human, 1974, Silent Action, 1975, and The Cop in Blue Jeans, 1976. As far as Giallo cinema, he would only appear in one more film, Don't Torture a Duckling, 1972 by Lucio Fulci. In the 1980s, Milian would find his way into American cinema, which would ultimately pay off with his role in Traffic 2000 by Steven Soderbergh. One of my favorite films of his is Compañeros, 1970 by Sergio Corbucci. Pierre Clementi was born in 1942 in Paris. He would appear in such films as Belle du Jour, 1967, and The Milky Way, 1969, both by Louis Buñuel. Partner, 1968, and The Conformist, 1970, both by Bernardo Bertolucci. The Leopard, 1963, by Luchino Visconti, and The Year of the Cannibals, 1970, by Liliana Cavani, along with Tomas Milian. He was typically typecast due to his androgynous looks. Unfortunately, his acting career would be derailed due to a drug charge which landed him in prison for 17 months before he was exonerated because of insufficient evidence. He would write a book about his experience in prison. Pierre would die in 1999 at the age of 57 due to liver cancer. The director, Maurizio Lucidi, was born in 1932 in Florence. He began as an editor. Amazingly, he was the original editor on Orson Welles' unfinished Don Quixote film, which would later be finished by Welles' assistant, Jos Franco. He would debut in 1965 as a director. His various credits include Pepla, such as Hercules the Avenger, 1965, spaghetti westerns, such as Hallelujah for Django, 1967, crime dramas such as State Line Motel, 1973, and his only giallo film would be The Designated Victim, 1971. The latter part of his career was involved in television, and he seems to have retired in the late 1990s from film. And those are the Forgotten Giallo films for 1971, Part 1. I hope you learned something new. If you are interested in watching these movies, go ahead and look them up online. If you do watch them, or you've already seen them, I invite you to leave your thoughts on them in the comments. Follow The King in Giallo on Instagram, and give a like to The King in Giallo on Facebook. Subscribe here on YouTube if you aren't already, and join me every week for new Giallo film content. Join The King in Giallo on Patreon for early access and exclusive content. Upcoming content on The King in Giallo will be the overview, review, and giallitally for The Fourth Victim, starring Carol Baker. Thank you very much for your continued support. This is Tanner Leeser for The King in Giallo, and if nothing else, I'll see you next time.
Stefano, credi di farmi paura? Sarebbe ridicolo che il sicario pretendesse di impressionare il mandante.